Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the Baker Institute for a presentation on the role of religion in diplomacy and foreign policy. This is a timely and important topic, as religion has often become a politically divisive topic both at home and abroad. In April, the Baker Institute welcomed Secretary of State Shaun Casey, who spoke on the important role of religious communities and what the role they can play in achieving foreign policy goals. He said, the more we understand religion and the better able we are as a result to engage religious actors, the more effective our diplomacy will be in advancing the interests and values of our people. So the relationship between religion and politics is an area our Baker Institute fellow Bill Martin has studied for decades, and which our distinguished speaker this evening and his team in the State Department are working to advance as part of American diplomacy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Martin, who will introduce our speaker. Bill?
Thank you, and I appreciate your being here. The program, the Religion and Public Policy, we joined when co-sponsoring this program with the Religion and Public Life program, and also with the Bonyek Institute, and I know a number of you probably learned about it through their contacts with you, and we like to we collaborate rather than compete, so we're happy to have those of you who may be coming through those avenues, and invite you to visit our website. You can go to just Baker Institute Religion and Public Policy, and it will show up, but wait a week or so. We're in the midst of revamping it, updating it considerably right now, but we certainly welcome you here. I want also to, before introducing our speaker, I want also to call attention traveling with him today is on their way to the American Academy of Religion in San Antonio is Leora Danan, who is a graduate of Rice in 2003, and also has been serving as Chief of Staff of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. And Dr. Casey says she really runs the place. And she has a distinguished career at the State Department and has been a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a lead author of an impressive report on U.S. government engagement with religion in conflict-prone settings, and was a fellow at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and developed a guide that's used by the Foreign Service Institute to help diplomats address the relationship and the issues of religion and diplomacy. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about Shaun Casey. I'm not going to read to you the program, because all of you have that. And I'm assuming that almost everyone here reads it at least at grade level. I'll be 80 next year, and I read it at 85-year-old level with comparable retention. And I want to, but Shaun Casey and I have we've never actually lived in the same place, but we've been in touch with each other and known of each other for a very long time. If you read his biography or the program there, you see that he holds various degrees and has a distinguished scholarly career. But he also has at the bottom, it says a Bachelor of Arts from Abilene Christian University, after saying that he went a Master's Divinity and a doctorate from Harvard Divinity School. Some of you who know me, or if you have read my biography at any time, my Vita, you know that I went to Abilene Christian University and also then went to Harvard Divinity School, and my doctorate from Harvard is also in religion and society. Those are not the only things that tie us together, but those are interesting ones. People ask me, and I ask Shaun if he'd been asked this so many, many times, how did you get from Abilene Christian to Harvard? And I usually just said, well, you head toward Fort Worth and turn left. But that's really not the full answer. There's a fuller answer, and I think I'm going to take the time to tell it. It's a prerogative of old men to tell stories. And in this case, I'm pretty sure you haven't heard it before, not always with my stories. When I went to Abilene Christian at age 16, I was not a prodigy. I just figured out at the end of my sophomore year in high school, 5 more courses and I can get out of here. And I was able to finish in 3 years and go to college at 16. And I had been preaching in the Churches of Christ for 2 years already, so I thought I'm going to go make a preacher, as the phrase was. But I was told, take a course from Lemoyne Lewis. He's a Bible professor, and you should take a course from him. You must do that. Try to get in his freshman course. Well, at that time, the professors at Abilene Christian were teaching 5 courses a semester. Yes, wow. But he had figured out he would teach Introduction to the Old Testament in 4 spots: 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. So he was teaching the same course. That limited his preparations. I was able to get one of the last slots in the 4 o'clock class. Within about 6 weeks, I was just captivated. I had just absolutely captivated by this man and his enthusiasm, even at the 4th hour. And one afternoon at class at 5 o'clock, I said, I want to do what you do when I get big. I want to be a college professor. And instead of saying, well, why don't you come back when you're 18? He said, well, then you need to go to Harvard Divinity School, and you need to take up your languages, take your Greek, take your Hebrew, and all of these. Okay, I knew Harvard was back east. I might have been able to place it in Massachusetts. I'm certain I had no idea that it was in Cambridge. But he stuck with me on that. He made me a grader the next year. He went off the following year to finish up his doctorate, and he sent me an iconic green Harvard book bag so that I would know where I was supposed to go to graduate school. And he stuck with me through a master's degree in biblical studies, and I took all of his courses, as I think Shaun did as well. And I went to Harvard Divinity School. While I was there, 12 other boys from Abilene Christian College were there. The people before me, people with me, and people after me, all sent by this one man, Lemoyne Lewis. His brother, Jack Lewis, who had gone to Harvard with him, sent another bunch from Harding, another Church of Christ school. So recently a study has been made that those 2 men sent at least 40 people to Harvard, to Harvard Divinity School. A substantial number of those became chaired professors in major universities, administrator. The first university chaplain at MIT is a Harvard Divinity School graduate, or as an Abilene Christian man. Professor, editors of significant journals. While I was there, it was a grand time. I took courses from Paul Tillich. Reinhold Niebuhr was Harvey Cox's first graduate student, if any of those names mean anything to you. But it's an interesting point that should not be missed, that professors can make a difference. Another point of this story. Lemoyne Lewis, I'll be fine. He died in 1987, and before long, a number of us who had appreciated him so much raised money, endowed a scholarship to take one person to go from Harvard Divinity School to go from Abilene Christian to Harvard Divinity School. The first person to receive that scholarship was Shaun Casey. So I helped this young man go to college, to go to graduate school. So it's always pleased me a great deal to watch his career, which has become so successful, and now here he is holding a significant place in the State Department with actually worldwide implication. And it might not all have been possible if it hadn't worked out, if it hadn't been for Lemoyne Lewis. So we both honor him tonight. Thank you, Shaun, for coming.
Mr. Ambassador Bill, thank you for the introductions, and esteemed guests, it's great to be here. I was going to say that Bill and I are members of a fairly elite academic club, but he preempted me there in that we're a very small fraternity of people who've studied at Abilene Christian and Harvard Divinity School. One of the lines that Lemoyne used when I screwed up my courage to go talk to him about the possibility of going to Harvard, he said, I felt like, I guess, where he was from, it wasn't Midlothian, was it?
I think it was.
Midlothian, yeah. And he said when he got to his first class at Harvard, he felt like he'd spent too many years in the cotton patch. And I felt analogous feelings the first time I sat in the classroom at Harvard Divinity School. But indeed, I would not be here today were it not for Professor Lewis. There's absolutely no doubt. I grew up in a small, rural, southern cotton farming town. in the Boot Heel of Missouri, I didn't know you could go to places like Harvard and Yale to study religion. I literally didn't know that until I met Dr. Lewis. So indeed, I would not be here were it not for those connections. So please forgive me for making an esoteric note historically, but it's always great to see Bill, and indeed it's great to be back here at Rice. My goal tonight is to do two things. First, I want to describe the mission and evolution of the work of our office, Secretary Kerry's Office of Religion and Global Affairs in the State Department for its 3.5 years of existence. And my central argument is going to be to you that a debate that's been raging in international relations circles over whether or not religion is a fit topic for diplomacy has shifted in recent years from the question of, well, why is religion important, to how is religion important in our diplomacy? And second, I want to give you a small sample of issues that illustrate how one ought to do religion in foreign policy or diplomacy by describing 3 specific policy areas where our office works. The first one is climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. The second one is the global refugee crisis, and the third one is countering violent extremism. Now, before launching too deeply into my lecture, I should note, in the unlikely case you missed it, we had an election a couple of weeks ago here in the United States, and its outcome it raises a lot of questions. And I've traveled for the last year all across the world, and I'm often asked by my international friends and interlocutors, well, what are the implications of this election for American foreign policy? I have to give you the caveat, I'm not in a position to comment on that tonight because we're in the midst of a transition from one administration to the next. And so during our question and answer time, please forgive me if I can't answer any of your questions about what's going on or what are the implications, because we are actually in this transfer of power, which really is a symbol of the depth and strength of our democracy, that we can shift from one administration to the next without chaos and without interruption. But I do hope we do have a robust question and answer time after I'm done here. I'll answer any question outside of that set that you might pose to me. Let me begin by giving you some of the context of the State Department and its historic approaches to religion. Before our office was established, before I was ever on anyone's radar screen as someone who could assist the State Department more robustly analyze and understand religion as a force in global society, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright noted that there was a gap in our foreign policy analysis, and that gap was a lack of robust understanding of religious dynamics in various cultures and contexts. She pointed out that when she was confirmed as Secretary of State, she had advisors on political, military, economic, and development issues, but none on the key topic of religion. Conventionally, the State Department culture had viewed religion somewhat skeptically, and it had viewed it either through the lens of international religious freedom or as a force that can only lead to conflict around the world. Now, while those two analytical frameworks are very important, as many of you know, religious leaders and actors and institutions are operating broadly and effectively in the wide landscape between religious freedom and religion and conflict. Now, you fast forward from Madeleine Albright to early 2013. Shortly after Kerry arrived at the State Department, he learned that he had the legal authority to launch the Office of Religion and Global Affairs based on an executive order that President Obama had signed in February 2009, very shortly after taking office. The groundwork and authorization for the office had been laid in the previous administration under Secretary Clinton, but the office had not been created. At that time, I was simply a humble ethics professor at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. I had known Secretary Kerry, then Senator Kerry, since 2005, as well as his Chief of Staff, David Wade. So as the story was told to me, when Secretary Kerry was being briefed by that endless army of lawyers that come to brief you when you become Secretary of State, one of them told him that he could create this office. And as the story went, he turned to David Wade, his Chief of Staff, and said, "David, call Shaun." So I was literally standing on the right street corner in Washington, D.C. when the piano fell on the sky on my head, and I was offered the job without actually having to apply for it. So I arrived in early March of 2013 in my office at Wesley Seminary, and I opened it up and I found an email from about 5:30 that morning from David Wade, the Chief of Staff. And he was asked me if I could come to the State Department that evening. And I paused, I counted to 10, and I responded saying, you know, David, I think I can fit you in tonight. I think I can make room to see the Chief of Staff. So I found myself later that evening about 6:30 sitting with the Chief of Staff and sitting with the counselor to the Secretary, hearing them describe to me this historic opportunity and then offering me the job to come in and launch an office in the Secretary's Bureau on Religion and Global Affairs. It's been an incredible opportunity for me as someone who has an academic interest in the role of religion in public life. But these past 3 years have been marked by a steep learning curve. I joke with my staff that before I came to the State Department, the most complex thing I had organized was a graduate seminar of 12 people that lasted for all of 13 weeks. I was asked then to come in 3 years ago to build a new office in the State Department that would complement and enrich the foreign policy work already being done by thousands of dedicated foreign service officers, civil servants, and others. We now have an office of 30 professional staff. We operate all around the globe. We have visited literally dozens of countries, visited dozens of our missions around the world, and in 3 years, we have accomplished a lot. I'm pleased to tell you that 2 months ago, we held a Religion and Diplomacy Conference, or RADCon, as our younger staffers named it, Comic-Con, RADCon. I was lost, but I said, yes, we'll call it that. The conference drew together 250 government leaders, academics, scholars, religious practitioners, and community activists, and representatives from religiously affiliated organizations. The conference showcased our methodological approach in engaging religious actors and assessing religious dynamics around the world. And it explored how these lines of effort can be expanded, deepened, and enriched as we look over the far time horizon. It demonstrated how, over the course of 3 years, the State Department made a commitment to systematically analyze the importance that religion holds with regard to foreign policy, and underscores Secretary Kerry's belief, actually it's the same quote you started with, Mr. Ambassador, when he said here in April at Rice, that the more the State Department understands religion and engages religious actors, the more effective U.S. diplomacy will be in advancing key policy interests. Our conference touched on issues ranging from coalition building and combating anti-Semitism to engaging religious communities in anti-corruption efforts in Nigeria, from the role of religious actors in global health to the power of citizen diplomacy in Muslim communities, and even engaging religion in addressing conflict. Now, all three of the issues I'm going to talk about in a moment are relevant to how we address religion and conflict around the world. Too often, the role of religion in peace building has been characterized in a strictly dichotomous way, that is, either as a driver of conflict or as a source of reconciliation. Now, as you can imagine, there's considerable debate and important discussions around this important theme of religion and conflict. The challenge is not to exaggerate the role of religion in either direction, either to say it's always about conflict or it's only about peacemaking. Religion is a multivalent, complex force in between those two poles. Rather, our job is to right-size it and to appreciate that religion intersects with other factors such as politics, law, economy, society, and culture. It's also critical to recognize that the relationship between religion and conflict or religion and peace building is neither static nor one-dimensional. What this means for our diplomats is that they need to understand that religion plays a complex role in conflict, sometimes serving as an inspiration for violence, at other times as a powerful force for peace and reconciliation. Our diplomats must develop the ability to understand and recognize where and how religious beliefs contribute to conflicts, or when they might be invoked to promote peace. This was made clear during a particular breakout session in our conference on engaging religion in conflict, in which an array of policy shapers, a former U.S. ambassador, think tank experts, and prominent academics discussed the religious engagement in situations of conflict and crisis response. They addressed the difficult questions of what a policymaker must consider in a crisis, how to identify and access key religious groups, communities, actors, and resources before, during, and after a crisis situation, and how to analyze the influence of transnational religious actors in conflict. The session brought together a who's who of religion and conflict around the world, and immensely important connections were made that day. Excuse me. Moreover, the panelists in the breakout session on religion and conflict offered clear-eyed analysis, underscored that religion is complex yet multivalent societal force that cannot be understood in binary terms as either a source of conflict or a panacea in addressing global challenges. Rather, they highlighted that religious dynamics must be understood and assessed within a specific cultural context. We need to understand what the scholars call lived religion. That is, how religion is interpreted and practiced in particular geographical contexts. This must be done very diligently and with sophistication. My mentor at Harvard, Father Brian Hare, once put it that this challenging work is similar to brain surgery, a necessary task, but fatal if not done well. Now that puts a pretty high burden on people in my chair looking at religion and diplomacy. So in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, we also recognize that engaging with religious actors and understanding religious dynamics does not supplant the diplomatic and policy efforts needed to address some of the biggest and most difficult foreign policy issues of today. In other words, understanding religion is not going to solve all of our diplomatic issues, but it may help us solve a number of our diplomatic issues. We are aware that religious communities can, and do drive social change. Many religious groups are at the forefront of initiatives that focus on encouraging sustainable development, promoting good governance, supporting women's empowerment, and advocating for social justice. I want to take a few minutes now to discuss a few of these lines of effort that our office has been involved in. The first issue is climate change, an issue that is not always recognized as having immediate linkages with religion or religious actors. But since the earliest days after Secretary Kerry charged me with establishing this office, global environmental issues, and climate change in particular, have figured centrally in our efforts to articulate the policy benefits of engaging religious actors. Though scientists have long sounded the alarm about climate change, the problem is no longer simply a scientific or technical problem. It is a political, economic, and social challenge, and above all, I would argue, a moral challenge. This underscores the critical role of the world's religious communities in providing a moral compass which to comprehend and ultimately act on this massive global challenge. Religious leaders and organizations were critical to the international effort to generate an ambitious, consensus-driven agreement on how to reduce global carbon emissions and expedite the transition towards a low-carbon future. They've also been tireless champions of the world's poor and are working to help those communities to adapt to the inevitable impacts of climate change. As the international community has moved to meet the threat of climate change, religious leadership has helped keep us mindful of the communities most vulnerable to its impacts and has helped sustain our will to provide future generations with unfettered access to beauty and the goodness of the earth on which we depend. Perhaps the most dramatic example is Pope Francis's encyclical last year, Laudato Si', which cites the physical harm being done by climate change to our forests, oceans, polar regions, and the economic harm on those who depend for a living on agriculture and marine resources. Pope Francis has not been alone. Religious leaders from a wide range of traditions have lent a moral voice and spoken about the need to be stewards of the planet. In the year leading up to the meeting last December in Paris of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, now that's a mouthful. In DC, it's known colloquially as the COP21. Our office held a series of briefings and consultations that brought together policymakers, representatives from secular environmental organizations, and religious stakeholders. These latter groups were generally aware of each other's unique contributions, but sometimes treated one another with some suspicion. Our first convening was a group of approximately 60 people from 3 different locations: faith-based organizations concerned about climate, the secular groups interested about climate and the environment, and the various policy shops in the Obama administration working towards an agreement in Paris. Now, based on my work as an ethicist, I was keenly aware there was tension in every direction between these 3 groups. The policy people were afraid of the advocacy groups. The religious advocacy groups felt like the secular groups would pat them on the head and they would call them when they needed a clergy person for a photo op, but they really didn't want to hear policy talk coming from the faith-based NGOs. But the secular groups wanted their mailing lists when it came time to run advocacy campaigns. So there was suspicion and, frankly, tension going in all directions. And in this first convening of 65 senior leaders from all three sectors, they affirmed my thesis that there was work to be done. And if they were going to build a consensus about getting the strongest treaty in Paris, they had all to come together, and our office played a convening role so that the heartburn they experienced mutually might be tamped down by the time Paris came along. This unlikely alliance was met with challenges, but ultimately all the groups took the necessary steps to encourage constituents and leaders to achieve a broad, ambitious agreement in Paris. Our efforts in the lead up to COP21 in Paris culminated with a symposium on religion and climate change held at the State Department and at Georgetown University. This two-day event drew from a wide circle of expertise, including theological perspectives, scholarly voices, representatives from faith-based organizations, and government officials from a wide swath of federal agencies. The symposium helped to ensure that religious leaders had the information about climate policy necessary for their many contributions to the success of the Paris Conference. It also illustrated the ability of our office to play this convening role and substantially advance the conversation about religious engagement in climate change policy. The achievements with regard to the Paris Agreement continue. Recently, it crossed the second and final threshold it needed to enter into force. Less than 6 months after signing of the agreement, enough countries submitted their instruments of ratification to formally join, and the Paris Agreement entered into force 30 days later. This rapid timeline underscores the widespread recognition of the urgency at hand, and it's a testament to the continued determination of states large and small to act on the social, economic, and moral imperative to address the dangerous impacts of global climate change. Policymakers now are turning to other concrete specific domains of climate policy, working to identify ways to implement and achieve the promises made in Paris. In this shift towards implementation, the Green Climate Fund was established and has a critical role to play in providing support to developing countries to advance their climate change objectives. The Green Climate Fund, which is managed through an independent secretariat, has over $10 billion pledged in contributions. As the largest contributor to the Green Climate Fund in terms of pledged contributions and paid in resources to date, the United States sees the Green Climate Fund as critical to leverage private sector capital flows to catalyze climate mitigation and adaptation results on the ground. We have, in our office over the past year, regularly convened religious groups for briefings on this Green Climate Fund, which have helped various religious networks support the fund and enhance its efficacy. In keeping with our mission to serve as a point of access for religious communities, we've sought to provide space for religiously affiliated organizations to orient themselves to a complex and still evolving policy financial apparatus. We are also watching COP22, which is being held right now, literally as we speak, in Morocco. And we are similarly identifying ways to engage the views of religious stakeholders in that unfolding process. Our office has similarly applied its engagement approach to another pressing foreign policy issue, and that is the global refugee crisis. As many of you probably know, across the globe, more than 21 million people have fled their homes and crossed international borders as refugees, searching for safety. This does not take into account the over 40 million people who've been internally displaced in their home countries. Quite simply, we are facing the largest displacement of human beings in the history of the human race. Over 60 million people tonight are displaced from their homes. 20 million have left their countries. 40 million are still living in their countries of origin, but they've been displaced from their homes. That's larger than the refugee crisis from World War II, which has been sort of the standard that we have measured atrocities against. We now stand with more people being displaced than in 1945. 2 months ago, President Obama signaled our government's commitment to addressing this issue by hosting the Leaders Summit on Refugees in New York to secure new commitments from 52 countries and organizations to increase humanitarian funding admitting more refugees through resettlement or other pathways, and increasing refugees' ability to access education and lawful employment. To model the spirit of this commitment to help the world's most vulnerable people, President Obama signed a presidential determination authorizing the admission of up to 110,000 refugees in the current fiscal year. In late September of this year, we met our goal for the last fiscal year of welcoming 85,000 of the world's most vulnerable from all different regions of the world. Now, I should note that figure is negotiated in concert with Congress. That's a presidential and congressional cap of 85,000. Now, you may be wondering again how the work of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs intersects with refugee resettlement issues, especially since the State Department conventionally deals primarily with foreign policy issues. Now, as a scholar, I'm an alleged expert in public-private partnerships between the government and the private sector or civil society on initiatives and shared goals. Yet, when I came to the State Department, I was unaware of the fact that there's been a long existing public-private partnership that's existed for decades in the refugee resettlement space. To resettle refugees, the State Department works with international and intergovernmental organizations, but we also partner with 9 national agencies to do the actual physical resettlement, and 6 of those 9 agencies are religiously affiliated. And again, I thought I knew this world as a scholar, and it turns out one of the most fruitful partnerships our government has ever had between the federal government and faith-based organizations has been in this refugee space for many, many decades. Now, this system relies on an array of local networks, religious leaders and communities, non-governmental organizations, social service providers, public schools, police departments, municipal government leaders, and individual volunteers to make the resettlement process possible. The success of the refugee resettlement process in the U.S. has required what I call a whole of society collaboration. To my mind, it's one of the best yet woefully undertold good news stories about the effective public-private partnerships that we can build in our society. Over the course of about 6 months this year, I had the opportunity to visit 6 different cities in the United States, both large and small, to meet with approximately 100 refugees and hear their stories, learn of the incredible work of local resettlement offices, and provide support to local religious communities and others who are so integral to the process of successfully integrating arriving refugees into American society. What was quite heartening to me was to see the outpouring of welcoming and assistance for refugees at the local community level. It is these local communities, NGOs, local resettlement offices, religious communities, schools, volunteers, and others that have devised the most innovative programs and support to help refugees. In cities throughout the U.S., religious communities and all these other organizations offer English language classes, senior programs, and other activities to ensure that refugees feel part of the community and don't become isolated. This gives me great hope about the future of American civil society. Despite some of the ugly anti-refugee rhetoric that persists in the U.S. media and in some political discourse, community members are still offering support for refugees despite all of the noise. This will become even more necessary in the years ahead as all the states in the U.S. continue to welcome refugees from all over the world. The final example I'd like to discuss about our office's approach to religion is our effort to counter violent extremism. As I mentioned earlier, our office helps colleagues in embassies and consulates around the world assess religion and religious dynamics. However, as I mentioned before, we try to right-size or contextualize the role of religion in our policy priorities. This means we try to recognize when religion is an important factor in understanding how we engage with a partner or approach a priority. And in those areas where it is a factor, we seek to determine whether it's a driving or a contributing variable. We don't take what's called an essentialist approach that presumes religion to be somehow at the core of every issue, nor do we assume that religion is irrelevant to issues such as violent extremism. Violent extremism and religion are often, and wrongly, synonymously used by some policymakers in policy discourse and in the media. However, in our research, we have found that religion is rarely the only or primary driver of violent extremism. There are a wide and diverse range of factors, such as politics, economics, social conflict, identity, individual psychology and ideology, including sometimes religious ideology. Other sources of grievance include localized conflicts, state-sponsored violence, public corruption, failed governments, political and/or socioeconomic marginalization, to name just a few of the complicated factors that move someone to motivate themselves towards violence. Again, understanding context is clearly a critical role, a critical component to the success of any initiative to counter violent extremism. Religion is always embodied in specific and complex contexts, and this is important to note in order to ensure that the role of religion is not generalized or stereotyped with regard to violent extremism. Now, what this means in very practical terms is that the factors that drive someone to join a violent extremist group in Syria may be very different from what drives another person in northwestern Pakistan or even in parts of Western Europe. Before deciding on any type of countering violent extremism engagement, our experience shows that research should be conducted at the local level to better understand drivers of violent extremism in a geographic area or among a specific target audience. Applying a data-driven approach focused on identifying these drivers can inform how we best engage on countering violent extremism, whether through religious communities and leaders or other institutions in civil society. Furthermore, there are often suggestions that in response to violent extremism, we need to seek out moderate voices or moderate Muslims. Now, it's our belief that this terminology, and more importantly, the pronouncement of what is moderate and what is not, is problematic. A call for moderation does not acknowledge the simple truth that those attracted to violent extremism may not find moderate voices appealing. The so-called moderate voices may be perceived as being disengaged or uninvested in questions of dignity that matters deeply to those looking for religious messages that resonate more fully. Our attitude with and our engagement with various groups is thus governed not by labels such as moderate or extreme, but rather by the substance of what groups do and actually say, or what they say and actually do, We need to and have begun approaching to design activities to counter violent extremism when it comes to religion with more sophistication. This means moving away from relying on religious leaders to provide theological antidotes to extremism and instead recognizing and engaging them as relevant and effective voices in other aspects of countering violent extremism work, from anti-corruption efforts to economic development to local peace building. With approximately 80% of individuals around the world identifying with a specific religious group, religion is an influential factor in public life and policy making, and I don't believe that's going to change anywhere around the world in the near future. I believe that our office has won the hearts and minds of the career staff at the State Department as they understand and appreciate the work we contribute to the strategic success of our diplomacy. And from the overwhelming interest in and positive comments on our recent Religion and Diplomacy Conference, the intersection of religion and global affairs is a topic about which academics, government leaders, and civil society representatives are taking note of. I'm pleased the State Department's increasingly reflecting on and accounting for the complexity of religion and in ways in which it serves as a source of identity, values, and worldviews for a majority of the world's population. And we are forging a path and serving as a model internationally in our approach to religion and its interface with foreign policy issue. The question as we look ahead is not why religion matters for our diplomacy, but how. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shaun. And Dr. Casey said he'd be willing to take some questions for a while.
Yes, sir.
Please speak loudly so people can hear the question.
I understand the importance of religious advice to the Foreign Office, but I think it's equally important for churches, especially those that have international missionary work, to be advised by the Foreign Office what to do and what not to do. And my example, although I come from Jerusalem, that was terrible in that sense, is China at the beginning of 20th century, where the missionaries, American Protestant missionaries, created animosity in China, and on the other hand, they were able to influence the Foreign Service of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, to support Sun Yat-sen that converted to Christianity, and Chiang Kai-shek. And both of them had the wives that were the daughters of a Chinese man that became a preacher in Boston. Mm-hmm. And that created the situation that America was in bad relations with China for 50 years. Right. And the Chinese still today are harassing the Falun Gong, which they see as a Christian religion, which didn't help them a lot.
Well, I would disagree on the last point. The Chinese don't see Falun Gong as a Christian religion. They see it as a religion that threatens there's no connection, at least historically, with Falun Gong and Christianity. But I do take your point. I mean, the larger point is the United States is a secular government. Okay, so our office does not advocate on the part of any form of religion or any form of religion over non-religion or non-religion over religion. So now one could argue that in our past history, the government has, in fact, promoted certain religious groups and perhaps held other religious groups down. That is not the policy of the U.S. government today. So we're not advocating on behalf of individual churches or religious groups. What we are saying is it's an empirical fact that religious groups are powerful actors in the world. And if the theory is right, to be successful as diplomats, we have to understand the world and all of its complexity. We cannot understand Israel today. We cannot understand the Middle East if we say religion is not a fit topic for analysis. In fact, we're going to make huge mistakes in that part of the world if we say religion doesn't matter. So we're simply recognizing the empirical fact that religion is a very powerful political and social force to varying degrees in different contexts. We are not here to promote specific forms of religiosity around the world. We are radically inclusive in who we meet with. If we were to line up all the groups we've met with, we've literally met with thousands of religious actors in the last 3.5 years across an astonishing array of religious groups, and we've never turned anybody away. And we've never invited anybody in exclusively to say, you're our favorites, we want to work with you, and we don't want to work with other groups. So your point is a hugely important one. And if you don't hear me say anything tonight, do hear me say we are not advocating, we're not promoting any form of religiosity around the world. Yes, sir.
Yes, how did you come up with the list of those as your 3 primary points of focus? Climate change. How did you come up with the 3 focal points as your major issues?
Well, I had a list of like 400. So first of all, be thankful I picked 3 instead of the hundreds. I tried to pick them because they're significant. I personally believe, as an ethicist, and if I could speak as an ethicist for a moment and not a diplomat, I think the challenges to the planet in terms of climate change, I think the challenge of the global refugee crisis and the challenge of religion and conflict are 3 of the thorniest, most pressing, bewildering moral issues the planet faces. So I thought I would start with 3 that have large implications, and from a moral perspective, I think are absolutely central to our foreign policy. I could have picked hundreds of other issues. Just for the sake of brevity and illustrative power, I picked those 3. Yes, ma'am.
I have 2 questions, but I want to start with the first one. So you communicated that the dialogue is going from why to how. Both words are very interrogative words.
Can you say that?
Interrogative words, both are very interrogative words.
Right.
So as we go from why, which more focuses on reason and purpose and circumstance, and we transition to how, which focuses more on method, degree, and condition, you communicated a lot throughout this that context is key. So when you think about our own local constructs and our own nation and our own world, as we move from this reason and purpose to method and degree and condition, you talked about data a little too. What are some key tools we can use in our own personal life to really see what the content that's around us, what this how really looks like as we go local, state, country, the world?
One of the most interesting lessons I've learned in the last 3.5 years is that today, some of the most innovative foreign policy is being done at the level of mayors and city and county councils. Okay? If sea level rises and you're the mayor of Norfolk, Virginia, and half your downtown floods regularly, you can't say, well, we're going to take that up in the next session of Congress, we'll get back to you. You've got very powerful people, including the U.S. Navy, who are saying, what are we going to do? What do you do when, if you're the mayor of your city and 5,000 refugees are resettled in your city in the last 12 months? Your public schools have to deal with that. Your police departments have to deal with that. Your religious communities have to deal. A mayor can't pass the buck. Or if they do, they find themselves being unelected and somebody else taking their place. So a lot of the innovation I saw in the refugee resettlement is not coming from the State Department in Washington, D.C. It's coming from these local communities that are I was in Des Moines, Iowa, and my mind was blown. When I think of Des Moines, Iowa, I think of deep snow and tall corn, right? Des Moines, Iowa has thousands of refugees they've successfully integrated into their society. And it's because of the local innovation. So the first thing I would say in terms of the data is know your neighborhood, know your context, all right? I was telling Professor Martin, my first visit to Houston was in 1975. I don't recognize Houston now when I come back. It's not 1975. The boundary started like in Jersey City. I guess it's Jersey City. It's probably an inner ring thing now, right? It's not on the boundary of Houston, Texas. So know your context. And if you see in this context, there's been radical transformation in terms of who is here, how many people are here, what the issues are that you're facing. So I think when it comes to the role of religion, the religious tapestry of Houston, I suspect, has been transformed in the 40 years since I first came here, such that you wouldn't, if you leaped from 1975 to 2016, you would probably not recognize the religious landscape in Houston, Texas. It's far more complicated, far more complex, and that diversity presents opportunities and it presents challenges. So one of the tools we advocate is what we call religious landscape mapping. We encourage our embassies and our consulates to simply say, who is here in terms of religious communities? Who are the small communities? Who are the large communities? What is the impact economically, socially, and politically of these groups as they interact with each other, as they interact in civil society, as they interact with the political environment? And you can do that kind of mapping, and that gives you a much more deeper background then to talk about how can we collaborate together in making progress towards addressing some of these issues like climate change, like the refugees, or any kind of violence and conflict. So I would say begin in your local context and map the religious terrain and try to understand who are these people. Then the second thing is, if you're a diplomat, you're paid to show up. It's not enough just to put it up on a PowerPoint slide and say, well, these are the religious communities and we know where they live. Diplomats are paid to go and engage and talk to people. And one of the things we've discovered is that historically many embassies are hesitant to go and sit across the table from an imam, say, from a form of Islam they've never encountered before. Or how do you meet with the Alevi community if you're in Istanbul? How do you engage with the Yazidi community if you're in Iraq? Many times these are communities that American diplomats have literally never met the leadership, to say nothing of rank and file. Diplomats then have to get out of the embassy and consulate and go into the field and meet these leaders and engage them. I often say that in the middle of a fire is a bad time to meet your apartment neighbor next door, right? You're not going to get a lot of collaboration when the building is on fire if you've never met your neighbor. And unfortunately, that's often the problem when it comes to diplomacy. When conflicts erupt, if you're looking for an archbishop or you're dialing for an imam or you're looking for a cardinal, the time to do that is to build a relationship when things are steady, when things are peaceful. So you do the landscape mapping, you try to understand who these folks are, but you go and you engage. That, to me, is part of the kind of engaging religious actors that we're talking about. But you don't have to be in Istanbul to do that. You can be in Houston and do that. And so,
my second question kind of piggybacks off of his question. So when you first talked about the three areas, the first thing I wrote down was safety and security, and then you said that they were very significant. So when you take that aspect into our local context and just the world, do you feel like, I mean, you're talking about like Maslow's most basic need. So would those be the things that would normally rise to the top and be a good place to start?
I'm not sure I grasp your question.
So when you said the three topics that you were going to discuss, I wrote down safety and security.
Okay.
Then you answered his question and said they were the most significant out of the 400. And so when I correlate those together, I'm then wondering from a local diplomatic standpoint, would it be best to start with those areas that threaten most safety and security?
My answer would be no.
Okay.
I think you start, someone said, where you stand depends on where you sit. which is kind of a silly saying. But I wouldn't, if you come away thinking I've talked about religion and diplomacy as only being about security, then I have failed tonight. I just gave you 3 examples, but that's often where people begin when we talk about the role of religion in diplomacy. We think about conflict, we think about violence. But if you heard me say, particularly with respect to both refugee resettlement and climate, traditional diplomatic issues like good governance cut across an amazing array of sectors. So if you're living in a country where you don't believe the national government has your best interests at heart, in other words, you don't have public schools, you don't have food, you don't have trade, you don't have a clean government, it's always in your pocket, your allegiance and loyalty to that nation state is going to be eroded. You're not going to care as much about the fate of a particular government if you think that government's not providing you the basic necessities for human flourishing. In fact, if you can't feed your children, you're not going to spend a lot of time watching CNN about how the election went, right? You're going to be worried about how do you feed your kids. So I would say religion cuts across all of those sectors. And so if I've given you the impression that of the hundreds of issues we work on, that it's only safety and security, I have failed. We talk a lot about good governance. We ran, and are running, I think, an amazing line of effort in Nigeria. Nigeria is arguably one of the most strategically important countries in the world. If Nigeria fails, the entire continent of Africa is going to be imperiled. Last September, when President Jonathan lost an election, and President Buhari won, when President Buhari came in, he discovered that the former oil minister had walked out of office with $6 billion in his coat pocket. Now, I don't know how you do that. I literally do not know how one transports $6 billion, but he did. So public corruption is a huge issue from the street corner level all the way up to the highest level of federal power in Nigeria. What we have done, to try to condense a long story into a short one, we've engaged a group of Christian and Muslim religious leaders to take on public corruption. Now, President Buhari himself has said he has 3 strategic goals for his administration. 1 is the defeat of Boko Haram. 2 is to restore the economy. And 3 is to combat public corruption. We initiated this conversation among 40 religious leaders. 25 were Christian, and approximately 15 were Muslim. They are now running a nationwide initiative calling out public corruption and cleaning up corrupt fiscal practices in their own congregations. And they're now running this initiative without any U.S. government sponsorship. So we came in and we convened the religious leaders. We gave them a platform. They have now established a nationwide initiative to combat corruption from the local level all the way to the national level. And that's not, on the face of it, a violence and security issue. It's a good governance issue. And that is as traditional a diplomatic effort as the United States Department of State has ever had, is advocating for good governance, clean and transparent governance. So I say what we have done in our Office of Religion and Global Affairs is sometimes we look at the obvious, religious-based conflict or religious involvement in sustainable development and humanitarian relief. Those are places where religious groups have been active for centuries. But we have discovered other areas like refugee resettlement, like good governance and anti-corruption, where religious communities provide untapped resources, and we've helped convene them and advocate that they get involved in those. And we think that there are many diplomatic efforts where religious groups can play a critical role going forward that historically we have not seen, and perhaps even in those countries they've not seen. So it's not all about peace and security, and I apologize if I gave you that impression. Yes, sir.
How do you effectively interact with foreign religious groups without their local governments feeling that you're meddling in their internal affairs?
Well, what we typically do when we go to a country and we want to engage, so in the early days of the office, I would go to a country and I would meet with as wide an array of religious actors as I could, given the time limits that I have. The good news is, we would call our embassy in that country and say, help us build out the list of people. And if that embassy has built the right trust-driven relationship with the local government, there's no problem. I never parachute into a country without getting permission of our embassy there to go first. I always sell our services as collaborative to make our embassies more effective. So we usually engage in a very deep conversation with embassy staff saying, okay, if we meet with that group, what are the ramifications going to be? And sometimes we wanted to meet with groups and local governments have said, no, we're not going to let you do that. So I want to leave with the ambassador happy with me, having gone to his country and visited. I don't want to come in and break a lot of furniture and then leave and have the poor ambassador deal with my clumsy inclination. So we always coordinate with the embassy, and they're the ones who can tell us where the tolerances are in terms of the local government. And one of the mantras that we have adopted is do no harm. I don't want anybody to get in trouble because I came to town and met with them, and I want to make their lives harder for them as a result of having talked to me. So we're very, very careful to calibrate who can we get in to see and under what conditions.
How would you describe the balance? I mean, you often run into problems where you can't talk to people, or is that a rare thing?
It's fairly rare. I mean, there was one time there had been a group, a particular sect of a particular religion that the host government had cracked down on and thrown a bunch of them in jail. And a number of them were released eventually. I wanted to meet with them. I wanted to talk to them and hear their side of the story. And we told the government, they said, oh, great, we'll get you there at 3 o'clock. What about 2:52, the phone call came saying, oh, they're not available for you to meet with them. So there have been some occasions where it was very clear when we asked to meet with a group, it just proved a bridge too far. And now I could have played the ugly American and sort of, thrown a hissy fit and ranted and raved. It probably wouldn't have made any difference. So, but no, typically, I think the typical experience is that international governments are quite intrigued why we're here as Americans, because historically, American diplomats coming from Washington have not always asked to meet with religious leaders. But by and large, people let us see who we want to see. I think it's the exception when a government says, no, that group's problematic. But no, it's a great question.
So are you unique on the world stage in terms of what we do in this whole effort?
I'd love to say yes. No one else has thought of this before. That would not be true. We are a part of an informal consortium of about 15 countries that gather periodically. I guess we've met informally now, 6 or 7 times, maybe in the last 3 years. The government. My last trip, I went to Turkey, I went to Finland, and I went to Germany. And both the Finns and the Germans are thinking of launching an office analogous to ours. And there are probably a dozen other countries around the world that are looking at it. Because more and more countries are waking up and realizing that if you don't understand the role of religion, you're not going to understand what's really going on politically and socially in a lot of countries. So we are, I think, the first country that's actually launched an office dedicated strictly to religion and global affairs. But it's my hope that this conversation will continue, and before long there will be many, many other countries that have similar offices to ours. And in part, I think they see the success we've had. And so these periodic meetings are actually very interesting and very, very robust, because we find we share many interests, and we look at some of the same problems around the world with similar eyes, and we learn from each other, things that we would not learn if we didn't talk to each other. So I'm actually pretty cautiously optimistic that these kinds of offices are going to grow around the country. Yes, ma'am.
So at the end of my second question, you made a statement that historically there are certain aspects where you really haven't seen religious components that you wish you would, like good governance. What are some of those other key areas?
Wow, that's a good question. I wish I had my staff here. They could fill in all the blanks. One of the things I have, the way we've organized the office, we have really 3 major teams. I've got a team of regional advisors, a team of functional advisors, and those are the 2 that I rely on most for these kinds of questions. The State Department divides the globe into 6 regions, and so we have 6 regional bureaus in the State Department. In many ways, they're the sort of skeletal structure, they're the muscular system, they're the circulatory system. If you're an ambassador in an embassy, you report back to Washington through your regional bureau. So if I was going to be successful in our mission to increase engagement with religious actors and assessing religious dynamics, I had to persuade the regional bureaus that if I could collaborate with them, I could make them more successful in their own strategic goals. So what I've empowered these 6 regional advisors to do is talk to the regional bureaus and say, are there ways that we can make you better at doing religion that will help you be successful in your strategic goals? So for instance, right now we're working on a new initiative on combating wildlife trafficking. Well, guess what? In Africa in particular, the demand for a lot of ivory instruments is driven by religious communities. So if we can engage leaders of African religious communities to say you don't have to have your form of devotional objects in ivory, if leaders can stand up and say, look, wooden objects and other materials work just as well in lieu of ivory, that can have a huge impact on the demand for elephant tusks. Now, again, if somebody walked into me 3 years ago and said, we want to work with you on the religious aspect of wildlife trafficking, I would have said, I'm sorry, I don't see it. Let me tell you another example. 2 years ago, an officer from our Oceans and Environmental Sciences office came in and said, Shaun, I want to talk to you about AMR. Now, I know a lot of acronyms. I've been in the bureaucracy now for several years. My wife's a federal contractor, and I went through the mental list, AMR. And I said, Jessica, I would love to talk to you about AMR, but before we have that conversation, you've got to tell me what AMR means. AMR means antimicrobial resistance. If you have a 1.5-year-old child who's prone to ear infections, you learn the hard way that antibiotics that worked when my children were small in the last millennium no longer are efficacious because there is resistance to the sort of standard antibiotics we use. Now, this is becoming a health problem in the United States. But when you think about the developing world, it can absolutely, in the face of crises like the Ebola crisis, HIV/AIDS, if antibiotics cease to work, there are going to be millions of people in peril in coming decades. So I said, Jessica, tell me, religion and AMR, I don't get it. Well, what we got finally out of that conversation is that we're launching a conference in the Vatican next month, bringing together leaders of the Catholic healthcare network in particularly Africa and in Asia. They're perhaps the largest, most well-developed global healthcare delivery system in those parts of the world. They need to understand the new techniques to address AMR. So we're bringing scientists together. We're bringing leaders from the global Catholic healthcare network to have a conference in the Vatican to begin a diplomatic, scientific, medical conversation about how we prevent this from tipping over into Africa and imperiling the lives of millions of citizens there. Now, again, when Jessica came and asked me, let's talk about religion and AMR, I said, I'm happy to talk to you, but I'm clueless. She drew the picture for me. So we've got this kind of entrepreneurial flexibility where I'll hear a pitch from any of the 80,000 employees of the State Department. If they could see an angle on religion that I don't see, God love them. I'm happy that they're there, but they know they can come to me and talk to me, and we'll try to see it. So there are many areas, wildlife trafficking and AMR resist are two, where we're now doing significant work, where previously, if it had just been left to my knowledge, we would have never gotten within 100 miles of those. So we take this sort of, now the other team is our what we call our functional team. We have functional bureaus in the State Department. They look at cross-cutting issues like human rights, climate change, medicine, and those kinds of things. So I've got a team that plugs in those sort of cross-cutting global issues as well. Yes, sir, and then we'll come back up there.
You mentioned a fair amount about the work of your office in relation to conflict, but what you've just said actually makes me ask the question is, do you see that you would be better off perhaps or focusing on philanthropy? Because what you've just explained to us is the way I've interpreted it, is that you find amongst certain religious groups quite a lot of philanthropic work going on, which is actually a better conduit towards perhaps moderation, that again you said that you had some problems with the word moderation. And you get organizations like the Aga Khan, for example,
right,
that nobody's ever really heard of.
Right.
that survive entirely off that and are, I would suggest, a force for good. So I just wondered if you could make any links by focusing less on conflict and more on philanthropy.
Well, we do both. So the Aga Khan Foundation has been in my office many, many times. The people who are paying for this conference in the Vatican are, in fact, is a Roman Catholic family foundation. So sometimes somebody comes to me with a great idea, but I don't have a budget. So if we're going to fund a conference in the Vatican to bring together 60, 70 leaders, I've got to find a philanthropist to pay for that who's already working in that space. So that's what we've done. We went to a philanthropy that I knew worked in this space. Philanthropies come to us all the time, wanting to know what we're working on and see if there's an overlap between our work and their work. The State Department has a civil society dialogue effort, and one of those is religion and civil society. There is a philanthropic civil society group that meets regularly. We have an Office of Global Partnerships, which is always looking to philanthropists to see if they cannot come, in fact, help fund some of our work, and that we can't find ways to partner together. So one of the things the U.S. government's doing more and more today is exactly this kind of public-private partnerships. Be it Fortune 100 companies or be it some of the largest and in fact some of the small and middle-sized philanthropies. So yes, they are our regular partners. They are in conversation with us all the time, because if we're not in conversation, we can't find those areas of overlap where we like to work together. There's a lot of religiously motivated philanthropy in the United States and globally, and the Aga Khan Foundation's a classic example of that. One more. Okay. I promised both these guys. Why don't you ask both your questions, and I'll try to take a shot at them in one answer.
Certainly religion informs culture, and as we've seen recently, can dictate politics. And it's encouraging to hear diplomacy trying to forestall some things before they get bad, and your examples are great. I think your point that diplomacy can start local is a very good one for Americans. And in Houston, the turning immigrants and refugees into new Houstonians, it's the faith groups that really have been doing a lot on that front. And I think a lot of Americans are not aware that in our embassies and consulates around the world, they often provide places for faith groups to meet that are either not otherwise unavailable, restricted, or prohibited.
Absolutely, I agree with that entirely. Yes, sir.
Very briefly, since this kind of office was very interesting introduction. Since these offices now are spreading around the world, you mentioned Helsinki and Berlin and Istanbul. Would you welcome a possible colleague in Beijing, representing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there, coming to the United States, talking to religious congregation and groups about, for example, climate change?
Would I welcome somebody from the government in Beijing, you're saying?
I mean, your colleague, your future colleague.
Of course.
Your foreign affairs in Beijing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
here and talk to religious congregations in the United States about climate change.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that at the heart of diplomacy is getting people to talk to each other. Without talking to each other, there's no progress to be found. And we had William Byrd, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, retired about 2 years ago, and a man I did not get to know well, but he gave a valedictory speech when he left. He was a career diplomat. I think he's put in 45 years in the Foreign Service. And one of the things he said was the last 10 feet in diplomacy are often the hardest. We can sometimes get very close to our allies, or even some people we wish were allies but are not quite there yet. And for whatever reason, we don't make the last 10 feet where we can actually make people-to-people connections. And I think that's the hardest part about diplomacy, is going into places where we've been alienated, or there's literal distance, or psychic or political distance. But as I see it, at the heart of American diplomacy is sort of overcoming your reticence, overcoming your hesitancy to meet the other country's partners and have these kinds of conversations. If we don't have them, we're not going to find ways to work together going forward. One of the most amazing things the State Department does is that we bring in over 80,000 international visitors a year to the United States on these international visitors leadership programs, where for 2 weeks these groups go to 3 American cities, and they include the flyover states. It's not just the coasts. We want to have these people see real America, if you will. And you think about 80,000 visitors a year over a decade, and almost 1 million people come and see what real life in America is like. I think, I saw a statistic the other day that's talking about how many foreign ministers and foreign ministry employees around the world came to the United States decades before on these visitors programs. I think that kind of person-to-person diplomacy is one of the most important things we do. But yes, if there's a foreign ministry official from China who wants to come, and the Chinese are actually interested, deeply interested in combating climate change. That's one of the few places where our people and their people can actually come together and have constructive conversations. So sometimes you get at hard diplomatic problems sideways or indirectly. If we can find a way, a path to forge bonds with people on issues that we see similarly, then perhaps the hope is that other days then the relationships will grow such that we can engage in the more tougher, vexing issues that we need to engage with them in. So the answer is yes. I think I would welcome that. Yeah.
I hope you didn't misunderstand. It wasn't to be you, but for the person to travel around and meet the religious congregation in the United States.
Yes. Well, for instance, we have brought, I meet with, our office meets regularly. Some of these visitors programs bring religious leaders to the U.S. I met with a group of Saudi religious leaders, and we sent them to Dearborn, Michigan. And so these were Sunni religious leaders, and they had never been in a room where Sunni and Shia leaders talk to each other as normal friends. They saw that for the first time in their lives in Dearborn, Michigan, in the United States of America. And their minds were blown that it was possible for the deep animosity between those two communities to be transcended. And they found it in the most unlikely of places, at least in their own mind. They found it in Dearborn, Michigan. So we do, in fact, bring religious folk here. Now, on the climate change side, I'm not aware of that, but I think that would be a great idea. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much. I'm even more encouraged to know that our investment was very good. We're getting a good rebound on that. You mentioned these groups coming. I've spoken to those groups as they've come to Houston a number of times, and I always enjoy it so much. About, 15 years ago, was a group from Russia, and there was one man, burly, and had a sweater on, and he just and I explained to them, I try to decide how they vote, how the groups vote, and the diversity, and the idea that the fact that we have a secular state means that we have sort of free market. So you can have not just one big church, but you can have the two seed in the Spirit, predestinarian, fire baptized, Holiness Church of God, number 2, Bishop S.C. Miller, bishop, presiding bishop, then anybody can start a church if they can make it go. And that kind of thing is really, it bubbles up, and so we have this tremendous diversity. But I mean, other kinds of things too. But how we do manage to get along remarkably. And this man I figured he was a KGB monitor, a guide for these others. And he came up to me afterwards. This is very interesting. I've never heard anything like this. I've wondered. This is very interesting. So we also had 5 or 6 mullahs from Afghanistan came, and one was more progressive than the other. And I was told when he went back, he got into great trouble for what he had learned in the United States. I want to thank you for coming. At the beginning, I'd planned to notice and appreciate the work of Professor Elaine Eklund, who's the director of the Religion and Public Life program, but I know she's gone back to France, and her stand-in for this period while she's gone is not here. The executive for the Banyuk Institute, Dr. Zara Jamal, has gone ahead to be at the American Academy of Religion and wants to talk with you tomorrow. But I had not noticed at the time that Dr. Milton and Laurie Banyuk are here tonight, who whose great generosity has made possible the Boniek Institute, with which we are happy to collaborate. So we welcome you as well. Thank you all for coming. Stay in touch with us, and we really appreciate your being here tonight, and thank you so much, Shaun.